So No One Will Save You is the story of Brynn Adams, I believe is her last name, who's an exiled, anxiety-ridden homebody in her small town. She lives alone. She doesn't really go into town except for groceries. She doesn't talk to anybody. She's a very quiet person. In fact, No One Will Save You is a very quiet film. There's no dialogue. There's none. I mean, let me rephrase that. There's a little in the background. You might hear a radio
There's
or
like
something
five.
every once in
There's
a while.
like 5 lines.
Yeah, there's no dialogue. But in this feature of no dialogue, what you do have is a woman who lives alone who discovers one night when something goes bump that not is all right in her house, and she ultimately discovers that there is a creature that's come from the sky, an alien of sorts, that is in the house with her, and she has to use her wits and her guile to figure out how to get out of there as quickly and as quietly as possible, because as the title says, no one will save her. The movie is on Hulu. Andy, what did you think of No One Will Save You?
You know, I didn't have to pay to see this, but I want to go find Stephen King and get my money back or my time back.
All right.
So Stephen King and a couple of other people were raving about this movie, talking about, it's really original, really captivating. And Stephen
King compared it to a Twilight Zone episode called The Invaders from 1961. He was like, it's incredible. Yeah.
But we just heard some celebrity buzz about this movie, and we're like, oh man, we got to check this out. And I'm just like, okay, Hulu wrote him a check. Someone wrote this bad a check, because I was not into this movie at all. The lack of dialogue really made it hard to pay attention. I thought it was really boring. There were some nice, I think, cinematography things, filmmaking things, which are interesting, but I was just kind of bored to tears. And I think that the performances are good. Caitlin Dever has to carry the entire film by herself, and and the story is told through just visuals, no dialogue. But man, I just could not get on board with it.
So I'm kind of in a similar boat. I do want to talk about what works, because there are some good elements here, and I think there's a reason it's getting buzz. I don't know if anybody got a check from Hulu, but I admittedly also did fall for the hype and was like, wow, Guillermo del Toro says this is great. King says this is great. And for what it's worth, I do think No One Will Save You is very much like an episodic horror feature. It's like an episode of The Twilight Zone, right? It's like an episode of Black Mirror. It feels very closed off. It feels very unique. Its world feels very niche. And Brian Duffield, the director, does a lot of work to make it visually distinct. Tons of camera resets. My God, this man resets the camera for everything. Nearly everything's on a tripod. Nearly everything's locked down. Everything is very thoughtful in the presentation of Brynn and her house and her emotions and her feelings. But right around the 30-minute mark, I started to check out a little, just because I felt like I wasn't grounded and I didn't really understand my character's motivations. They just have no voice for themselves other than what's visually there. And Caitlin Dever does a great job, but it isn't enough to really carry my interest. And I think the advantage of a format like Twilight Zone or Black Mirror in being episodic is it's just a little shorter. 90 minutes of nothing as far as dialogue goes is rough, and it's visual and it's tense when it needs to be, and that stuff works good, but I just had trouble staying tuned in, and that was kind of my big problem with it. Andy, you felt a little bit harsher, I think, right? It's what do you got?
Yeah, but I'll try to stay positive, because I think there are some redeeming qualities. It was just the overall idea just doesn't work for me. The lack of dialogue. It was like watching A Quiet Place, but a lot less interesting, because at least there is occasional dialogue and big action. So starting with the story, part of it is I couldn't get into the main story. I was much more interested in the B plot. So the main A plot is this, what is essentially an alien invasion, home invasion film. And then there's the B plot of why is she an exiled person in her community? There's hints of things that happened long ago. No one will talk to her. No one smiles at her. She is shunned. That was a much more interesting part of the movie for me. I wanted to know more about that, and we do get a little bit more of that development, but I was much more interested in that than I was the kind of alien invasion side side of it. And again, it's just the lack of dialogue. So just putting that aside, that doesn't work for me. I do think it had some good elements going for it. It just needed more.
Yeah, I think it's an idea that works better on paper, which is fitting because Duffield is a writer first and foremost, who's written some decent features. He worked on the Divergent series. He wrote Jane Got a Gun with who was that? Natalie Portman. Underwater, which came out in 2020, that got sold to Disney through the 20th Century Fox merger, starring Kristen Stewart and T.J. Miller, if you remember him. We saw that for the show. Not a bad feature. He worked on the Babysitter horror films, and he did direct one movie before this, a rom-com called Spontaneous, which he also wrote. He's a writer before he's a director, and in that way, I think this fits in with exactly the kind of stuff he's written, right? It's a bit supernatural, might have some kind of monster, horror elements, like these things I'll check out, sci-fi even. And for direction, like, it's a really solid swing at it. But it just gets clunky. Like anytime Brynn interacts with another person, which happens a few times in the film, there's no explanation why they wouldn't speak. Like it just feels out of place and wrong, and it just like it just feels forced and contrived to fit the formula here. I think it would have been tighter if she doesn't ever leave the house, but she does. She goes into town. She gets groceries during the film. Like she runs errands. Like, and that's fine. But it just starts to feel a little forced. Now, when she's at home and she's alone and there's something in the house with her, that fits. That totally tracks. I get that. But the moments that aren't filling that just feel a little dry. And they're supposed to be the moments where you breathe, right? In a horror film, you got to have that back and forth where it's intense, it's really intense, then it backs off, give your audience a chance to reset. Those moments are the moments where you're going to want to get your phone out. Those are going to be the bits where you're like, I'm going to get up and get a snack. I'm going to go to the bathroom. And that just keeps you disconnected. As a streaming feature, I think it works great in the space. Had this been theatrical, I think it would have underperformed. And I think Hulu put it in the right place where it needs to be, especially considering celebrity buzz. I mean, my God, this movie's gotten some attention.
Yeah, and I think part of what doesn't work for me is it gets very repetitive where there is like something chasing her and she like barely gets away. And then we do that sequence several times throughout her house, like, oh, it's chasing her upstairs, she has to jump out the window, or she's downstairs, and like it just kind of keeps changing location, but it's the same bit over and over and over, and it's just like, and because there's no dialogue, you kind of feel like you don't have to pay attention. Like, just look up when there's like when the movie gets louder.
Right. I mean, you do pay attention, but yeah, it doesn't keep you as grounded. Like you really just aren't as interested because your brain just kind of glosses over what you're seeing. It's actually like the inverse for me of like this trick that people have discovered on TikTok to get more views. If you have crappy video, use good audio and it'll like fool your brain. That's why you see a lot of people holding up like headphone earbuds, like and talking into the little microphone there, because the audio is so much cleaner that when you're watching it, you will stay tuned in because you can clearly understand the person who's talking to you, and it's like subtitles for your mind. You don't have any of that with No One Will Save You. And in that way, like it's almost more experimental than it is like traditional feature. And I think that's why it's inspired some of the more experimental creators out there, right? Like Guillermo del Toro, an acclaimed monster movie director. Like, obviously, he loves the alien stuff in here. Stephen King likes odd horror. Of course, he's written it for years. He changed the game. Like, of course, he's into it. I can totally get those people endorsing it. But I think, like, that should probably come with a bit of caveat that it's, like, particularly niche. Like, this movie is definitely different in a way that I think people will either be into or won't be into. If somebody asked me about this at a house party, they'd say, hey, I watched No One Will Save You. I'd say, what'd you think? And I feel like almost everyone would go, it's all right,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And like, that's kind of a shame for what I thought was like really glowing praise. Maybe we were too hyped, Andy. Maybe we were too into it.
I think that's definitely part of it, but also, I mean, there was just so much buzz. There were like you said, Del Toro and Stephen King were raving about this. There was just lots of other buzz. Looked like it was like something really special, but and sometimes, a streaming movie can be that. We watched a movie called Run a couple of years ago that was a straight to streaming feature that was really, really exciting and kind of a smaller, almost Twilight Zone level episode kind of thing. And it was great. This one, not quite so much. So yeah, I think we were definitely overhyped for it.
Yeah, I do think it's an honorable. I mean, like honorable mention. I think Brian Duffield's obviously going to get more directing work. I know he's got another project on IMDb upcoming. Clearly, he'll continue writing. Like, I don't think the issues in his scripts. If anything, I think this one is just a really big dream and a really bold, like, first real outing for a director. I know he's already had one feature, but it clearly didn't get that much attention, not nearly as much as this has. I don't know. I wish I had more to say about it. I feel like it's a short review. The music in it is fine. The action in it is fine. The suspense in it is pretty good, but it comes, later in the feature like any horror feature does. And like it takes a while to get there. And it just, I don't know. It grates on me like nails on a quiet chalkboard, I guess. Any other thoughts on this one for recommendations, Andy?
I'm ready.
Andy, would you recommend No One Will Save You?
I'm going to say a pass on this, even though it's straight to streaming, and if you already have Hulu, it's available. But I just could not get into it. The lack of dialogue just made it really kind of painful to sit through. It's not very long. It's only 90 minutes, but it just felt slow in a lot of places. It gets really repetitive with some of these chase scenes that seem to kind of just happen over and over. Caitlin Dever does do a great job. She's always fine in everything she's in. So she is a highlight, and I think there's some interesting cinematography that we get to see. But it's like you said, it's like a TV episode that is just too long.
Yeah, like recommending it would be like recommending a B plus. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I guess. If you're into experimental, you want something different. If you're like, I want an odd horror feature to watch, like give it a go. You might really like it. Like clearly, it's got its fans. But No One Will Save You just didn't quite do it for me. Didn't quite hold my interest the way I think it intended to, and without really a script to comment on, without a lot of kind of the nuances of a more traditional feature. That might be its biggest offense, missing that mark because it's so clearly trying to hit it. I check it out if you're interested. I guess I don't think I'd recommend it. I think I'd probably say, being October, you go look for maybe an older horror feature, maybe something 2014, something really exciting that your co-host on a podcast recommends that we're going to talk about in just a minute with It Follows. Before we get to that, we need to talk about our middle segment here, some drama from the set of a new, exciting Warner Brothers feature. Andy, what do we call this segment?
It's time for the death of cinema.